and to continue the discussion further. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Our next speaker is Dr. Gay Bradshaw. She has 2 doctorate degrees in ecology and psychology, a master's in geophysics, and a bachelor's in linguistics and Chinese. Her diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder in free-living elephants launched the field of transspecies psychology. She is the founder and director of the Kiraloo Center for Nonviolence and the Tortoise and Hare Sanctuary, located in Jacksonville, Oregon. Please type your questions into the Q&A and Dr. Bradshaw will answer them at the end of her talk. The Greenfield Public Library is very pleased to sponsor Dr. Gay Bradshaw. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real treat to hear all these different voices and ideas. I live in Southern Oregon, just 5 miles away from California on Takelma land. And most of the time I'm spending time with our sanctuary animals as well as the wildlife, our wildlife neighbors. I wanted to say just a quick sort of a carry through about the whole concept that Scott spoke about, imagination. And this sounds like kind of a plug, and it is in a sense, but we have a webinar that I started through the Kiraloo Center. It's a free webinar every Sunday, every month Sunday. And it's called Living One. And its little tagline is, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? And so we started it as kind of a way to bring in conversations for the imagination of what is this world, that we're envisioning, and where, like I said, what is wrong? That's easy to kind of get your laundry list for, but using the imagination with practicalities and understanding to really start to imagine what it looks like. Our particular emphasis has been on animals and nature, in the sense of bringing them from being the backdrop of the colonial human agenda to speaking and agentic and self-determined peoples. So today I'd like to talk about the book, Talking with Bears, Conversations with Charlie Russell. And I'm going to put this up here. And I'd like to begin with a passage. It's actually just a few passages from the preface of the book. And then I'll talk a little bit about the book and also Charlie Russell. Some of you may be familiar with him. So if you just sit back and relax a little and enjoy the beautiful photographs. Hang on. For some reason it's not moving. A little technical thing here.
You might try the arrows on your keyboard, maybe.
There we go. A female brown bear is standing on a grassy bench, looking down at a patchwork of snow and turf. Her nose lifts as the wind passes. The air carries the sweetness of blossoms and the quiet growl of a snowmelt river. It is summer in Kamchatka, Russia's far eastern peninsula. For 7 months, the land has rested in frozen slumber. Now, with the season's warmth, life bursts into a raucous cavalcade of color. Streams choked with crimson salmon, meadows laughing green, and stark sky beaming blue. It is bear time, time to glean every calorie possible in preparation for the coming winter. The subject of the bear's gaze is a man with tousled gray hair and welly boots. He is sitting on a pocket of grass nestled between the arms of a snowbank. Bear cubs are playing near him. Without shifting her gaze, the bear begins to walk slowly toward the man and cubs. There is intention in her pace. Suddenly, an explosion of life disrupts the tranquility. The cubs have caught sight of their mother. They run joyously toward her, their faces open with broad, toothy smiles. The adults, man and bear, exchange silent greetings in the space above the chaos of rambunctious youth. Cub minding duties finished for the day, the man rises and tucks his camera back into its case. As he leaves, he glances back at the mother and child reunion. The female, who would become to known as Brandy, is lying on her back with her cubs nursing eagerly. Walking stick in hand, the man heads for home. It's been a grand day. Thank you. Yes, that's the beginning, the preface to Talking with Bears, Conversations with Charlie Russell. And I wanted to just say a few things. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Charlie. Charlie lived to be 76 years old. He was born and raised in just over the hill from Glacier in Waterton National Park area. And he was the son, his grandfather came from England and homesteaded there. And Charlie basically grew up on the land and he spent all of his time there. He was, and this is significant because when he was in high school, he dropped out because, as he said, uh, none of the teachers wouldn't answer any of the questions he thought were really important. And he really lived in the land and with the land. And it became his lifelong pursuit to really understand grizzly bears. And the brown bears that I spoke about are the counterpart in Russia, where he spent 10 years. And that was a really seminal experience for him. And one thing that really stood out, and I'd like to just go in a little bit more about Brandy, is Charlie went to Russia again for 10 years. It was just after Gladnost and Perestroika. So just like when I had gone to China, when there was this sort of gap in the government and no one knew what was really going on. And there were some wonderful opportunities for exploring. And Charlie went there with the purpose of really trying to demonstrate to people, not only in Russia, but elsewhere, that living peacefully and in harmony with these giant bears, thousands of pounds, was possible and very natural. Now, he had spent quite a bit of time, like most of his life, in North America. But as you're well aware, the majority of grizzly bears and other bears were driven out of the coterminous United States. There's a tiny little pocket, and they are in Alaska. But basically, bears used to extend coast to coast and down to Mexico. So he felt that if he could go to Russia, he would be able to encounter bears that had not been assaulted generation after generation after generation and slaughtered, like so many of the wildlife, with the onset of European occupation. And of course, that intensified as populations grew. So Brandy was, he went there and he built a little cabin. And Brandy was a bear that just showed up. She was a female bear and she just kind of started hanging out. And one day, she had her cubs with her, and he was nearby, and she just left her cubs. And basically, that became the beginning of a very solid relationship. She went off to do bear things, as he said, you could hear her roaring, going after unwanted males, looking for food. And she essentially, as he called it, hired Charlie as a nanny. So this is kind of an extraordinary thing because the predominant myth, and I think it's important because we are talking about myths that are understood as truths. And the myth, and it's still very, very deeply ingrained, both in the quote unquote public, as well as in the agencies who promulgate this myth, that the most dangerous being on the planet is a mother bear with her cubs. And I think obviously this was not the case. Charlie was an extraordinary person. And in the book, Charlie and I ended up working for 10 years together. And our collaboration began because I had all these scientific degrees, et cetera, which were really supposed to be the sort of the Christmas tree, the tree part of which is jewels of personal experience would be showcased. And the science would, quote unquote, give the legitimacy to that. And that's kind of a shtick that I did. I wrote a book about elephants, where really the effort was to dissolve this notion of the division, this very sharp division between how Western science and colonial science and colonialists look at nature and humans as being very separate and extremely different. And so that's really how we got going. And we would talk back and forth, and the quote unquote science, which really was neuropsychology, et cetera, really predicted what Charlie began to understand and see in bears. And he was very specific about using the term understand as opposed to study. Understanding, he said, is when you care about someone and you love that person, that's when you begin to understand who that is. And that's a very different philosophy than what is promulgated in Western institutions and scientific institutions and the agencies. So he spent, I guess he was there for 10 years. He had to leave when it got so cold. But Brandy basically for 7 years and 3 sets of cubs hired him as her nanny. And they had a very deep relationship. And she obviously was his tutor, an accompaniment, and he was an accompaniment for her in terms of what she was doing in her life. And there was also a thread in there which he had not anticipated, and that was when he arrived the second year. He was asked to rescue these baby brown bears that were in a zoo. Their mothers had been killed and orphaned, and they were going to be killed because they were becoming bears, big bears, and they, were no longer cute. So he was asked to reintroduce them. So he took them, and there were 10 bears over those 10 years, and he took them to the cabin, and he essentially became a bear mother. Now, what that meant really, and this is what's discussed in the book, is what does that mean? Charlie had definitely a human identity, but what was critical was that he shed this socially conditioned identity of an agenda of a human to be able to share and understand and learn bear values in society. And you can relate this back scientifically. In that book, I don't use science. I can talk about it later. But in the notion of that's how we raise our children, our human children, is we create a microcosm for teaching them and having them experience things which readies them for the environment in which they're living. So, we are the microcosm, whether it's a macaw family in a bowl in Central and South America. That bowl is where the families that feeding the babies. That nest is where they're learning, their brains are being wired, et cetera. You can go in those kinds of heuristics. And then they move on into the broader society of the flock, et cetera. So Charlie was really invited into Bear Society of Cambalnoya. That was the valley in which he lived. And he just integrated into that society in a very seamless way. And, he was very humorous about it. He, like you said, he had to learn certain things. He had his cubs, and he got really into being playful with them. And he pissed off Brandy one time. She came roaring down at him because she was working. She was looking for fish. And so she was teaching him, and he learned from her, and they had this incredible, wonderful relationship. And one of the things that when I wrote the book, Charlie died. We worked for 10 years, and he had health issues. He didn't get eaten by a bear. And I wrote the book de novo. It was based on 10 years of notes and conversations, et cetera. And I would call the subtitle to the subtitle, The Science and Philosophy and the Ontology of Charlie and the bears, because it truly was an intersection of an ontology. In other words, a way of being and their value systems, and a pedagogy of how they taught each other and learned from each other. And their knowledge system became something that they shared, not just between them, but in terms of embedded and what Charlie would call fitting into nature. So it was this notion of really shedding the agendas, the things that we're talking about, these kind of like post-its of prejudice and preconceptions that have been accumulated, particularly over these colonistic times, which has been a dominating kind of culture. And so I wrote the book de novo, which was quite excruciating. I really was in deep grief of losing Charlie. I mean, I knew he was probably going to die soon, but he was truly someone that was very special. We shared so much together in terms of asking questions and talking about the animals and what we saw and what we didn't see, and really deepening that understanding. And so I wrote the book, and again, it was excruciating for another reason, is that I really wanted to channel in that sense. I was very, very careful in terms of, we were not just in the same book, we were on the same page, but we were not necessarily on the same paragraph. So I wanted to make sure that I could clear, my views, my, projections inside when I rendered that book. And it really developed organically. Charlie has written several other books, and some of the experiences that are described in Talking with Bears are in his books. However, they've gone into it in a kind of a more explanatory way, understanding Charlie. So it was really trying to talk about who Charlie was and who these bears were and what their relationships were. And so, this is an arc in his life. Charlie went through many changes himself. One of the chapters is about this black bear early on in his 30s. And he's with his son, and they have an encounter with a mother bear. And that's when he encountered his privilege. He, he thought he understood bears and everything like that and loved bears. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but basically she attacked him and the son. And it was a very upsetting experience for him, because in retrospect, he realized that he was arrogant, and this was a black bear, and it was his fault, and he was not listening to the bear, like who she was, what was going on in her life. And that was a major turning point from him. And that was really the foundation for his exploration later in life. And again, losing these kinds of preconceptions and really coming down to our essential self. So Charlie would be, rolling in many ways in his proverbial grave if he heard me talking about spiritual, but truly, this is a profoundly spiritual way of living on the planet and with these bears. And it wasn't just the bears, it was the way Charlie was with everyone, even with humans. And he was an incredibly kind and loving person. And I would say that there were, I asked him one time, I said, so Charlie, what are the two main principles in your life? And I had written down mine. And he said, truth and love. And those are the same of mine. So essentially, the truth and love, it's very similar. The truth is vertical, and the love, you can find that in other kinds of traditions in terms of that. But that's really who Charlie was. And he's extraordinary, but in a very ordinary kind of a way. And he truly lived like a bear. Did he think he was a bear? No, he didn't. And that's a very important kind of a thing. And I think it's very useful, perhaps even to the conversations that we're having, is that his focus was really on the inner self. Here's this person, Brandy, for example, and who understanding who she was, learning who she was. But she happened to be in a bear suit, and he happened to be in a guy suit, a white guy suit. And, the frog happens to be in a frog suit. And obviously, our suits have a great influence in terms of how we navigate our life. But really, the core thing was coming down to the essence of true nature in that way. I will say is that there's no science in there at all, and that's on purpose. I have written about science a lot, and I think it's a very useful heuristic. I think it is a transitional heuristic, because it occludes and it disempowers individuals. And that's why the book is really written from the experiential with no science. It can be communicated to people who read science, but truly Charlie's depth of understanding, and he writes about this, is that he learns and he knows through experience. So he was absolutely unrelenting. He'd have a hypothesis. There's a story about the teepee rings, and he'd get this bee in his bonnet. Something's not right when you'd see something; it looks off. And he would follow it and follow it and follow it until he solved it. But it was by doing it, and that's a very important thing, because that was, I believe, plus his openness, was why he was able to live so well with bears. I think living with bears, I think Charlie would agree, living with bears is easy. Unfortunately, there's absolutely zero understanding, relatively speaking, of most humans toward bears. Certainly, when you're looking at it from the perspective of people going out into the woods, and the things that come from the agencies and that are written in science, they have no foundation. The formative principles about bears have no empirical experiential foundation. And you can hear people like John Muir talking about that, and others. And of course, you do hear in the documentation of many natives, people who have lived with bears. So the book was not written without science, and my own work is going in that direction, because I think part of our transformation as a species, this is the we part. Not all humans have done what has been happening to the planet. There are indigenous peoples that never did what we do. Animals have the same. I'll take back my science hat. I started a field called Transspecies Psychology, which is nothing more than naming what the foundation of all of science says. That all animals, and I think it extends to trees and all beings, have the same brain, mind, and consciousness, and the capacities that go with them of things that we value, such as emotions, and being able to think and imagine, and and spiritual experience, etc. We do things differently, but we all have those capacities. That's a very conservative, within the science realm. You don't have to believe it, but within that is a very conservative interpretation. It's not a popular interpretation, because our entire modern dominant society is based on the exploitation of non-humans. And I talk about in another little lecture on orcas. I was asked to talk about orcas. And I go through the whole thing, orcas, ants, octopus, they all have what we have from that perspective. And yet they don't do that. And why they don't do that is because they haven't become unrooted from what Charlie and I were calling nature's ethics. There's a fitting in, there's an understanding. And that we see when we look out into nature as such. We see harmony, we see coherence, we see meaning. Now, that doesn't mean a puma, for example, that's another story. People say, oh, nature is so violent. Well, neither Charlie nor I thought it was violent. If you see a puma, for example, this is a story that he experienced. He was walking from home, and he saw all of a sudden these deer radiating out. So Charlie, being the inveterate, what's going on? And he saw it was a puma. This is in his house, just not far from his house, called this cabin, a Hawk's Nest. And he saw there was a cougar, and a cougar had taken down one of the deer. But the deer were only a couple hundred meters away, and they were eating. And he recounted that to a biologist, and the biologist said, well, that's because deer don't really care about each other, and things like that. And I disagree with that from my own observation. Certainly Charlie did. Of course they do. I've seen mothers grieve terribly when they've seen a cougar take one of their babies. We see that all the time. But there's a kind of a fitting in that the deer know that's what the job of the puma is. They run, they're scared, no one wants to die. That's what the puma does. Puma's got his food. Life goes on. And that doesn't mean that the deer are not grieving, but they're grazing. So this is kind of a different way of looking at and embedding humans into nature again, and understanding what that embedding feels like and what the responsibility and accountability is for that. So again, as I said, I don't use any science because I think most of our institutions and are definitely science, and science is just an umbrella for other kinds of scholarship. I'm not saying across the board. I do think there's some stellar individuals within those institutions. However, science itself is way, way out of step with reality. And it still remains very anthropocentric. And I would say it's very ethnocentric, where traditional ecological knowledge is something, it's commodified and it's added on. So, in a sense, it's disempowering. I have students that come to me and they feel so disempowered. And that's where we need to go back, and I think Charlie's book, Talking with Bears, and his kind of is a little bit of a primer that can help us understand how to be human in as part of nature. Now, the last chapter is called Boehm's Bear, and that's the one science. And I introduced Charlie to David Bohm. It was an interview of David Bohm, who's a quantum physicist who has passed. And that was because we kind of hit a standstill. I said, how do we communicate? Because we were using science as a medium of, kind of bilingual discussion. And so he met David Bohm. I was on an interview, and it was like long lost brothers. So that last chapter really talks about David Bohm's experience. It weaves that in with Charlie's in terms of how they live and how they saw the world, and in the philosophy and their own experiences in nature, which informed both of them, informed David Bohm in terms of the development of quantum physics and quantum mechanics, and it informed Charlie in terms of how he conducted his life and saw his experience on the land. So that's kind of a dense snapshot of the book and the work that I'm engaged in.
So thank you. There are some questions typed into the chat, and I encourage the audience to put their questions in the Q&A. The first one is about the definition of science. So the other panelist is writing, the indigenous scientist, Robin Wall Kimmerer, was mentioned earlier. And these scientists talk about indigenous knowledge as a form of scientific inquiry that isn't founded on colonialism and Western views of science. So do you want to address that?
Yes, I mean, the one kind of simplistic response is there's science, like I would say for Charlie, I called it the science and philosophy and ontology. And Charlie was not schooled in the science like biology, if you go to college, you go to school, there's a certain curriculum. And that curriculum embodies a particular agenda. I mean, that's not new. It has then become, science has become a worldview, which is a culture. So to me, the science, like Robin, she has background that they're all science. To me, they're all the same. Animals have a science too. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of being in the world. That's in my mind, and it's perfectly okay. I'm using the distinction to kind of broaden it and also be inclusive of saying animal science as a way of thinking, because they have a science, which is a kind of a way of thinking in an analytical kind of way. But the values, the ethics, the umfeld in which they're in, creates a particular kind of science, if you want. I don't know if that answers the person's question.
She says yes. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe you could go into one of the most enjoyable stories in this book that I really loved, was about the bears and the teepee rings, and how the bears were able to well, I'll let you tell the story.
Well, I'm delighted. I mean, thank goodness you have a bell here, because I could go on and on. Yeah, there was one, there's a story and this very much describes Charlie. So Charlie was out with a friend, an archaeologist friend, and this is where he grew up, and he grew up with the archaeologist. Charlie was definitely a man of that country. And they were having a conversation, and the archaeologist said, it's funny, there's no teepee rings. Okay, so teepee rings are these stones that the pagan, there's different names for the Indians who live there, they had teepees. And then they have these stones which hold the leather flaps down. So when the wind comes and the cold, and they would leave with their travois, wrapping up the teepees. And Charlie, as a boy, saw this, but they'd leave the stones, and they would go off into different places for hunting grounds, and then they would return, and they would have the stones there, and then they would put them around the teepee. So the archaeologist as well, obviously, they didn't live in teepees. They must have had some kind of other structure, housing structure, whatever. And Charlie thought, well, that's kind of weird, because when you go out on the plains, which wasn't very far, there was lots of teepee stones, and they began to disappear because they sink in. People were not using them anymore. So what Charlie did is, and so he was disagreeing with the archaeologist. So what he did is he went up to the place where the pagan were occupying. He went to school with them, and he made teepee rings. I mean, he gathered rocks that were very similar to the stones that were used by the natives there for the teepee thing, and he made a ring with a diameter and spacing that emulated the teepee rings. And he would go up every so often and check them out. And over time, he saw they started to move. One was here, it's a nice round circle, and another one moved. Well, what he discovered, and after time, they really ceased to be a geometric circle, right? They were just kind of scattered. And he found out they were black bears, and black bears would go up looking for larvae, right? So they see these stones, and they're kind of like, huh. And they would, fate their claw, open it up, and there was larvae. Sometimes they're larvae, sometimes they're not. And he said it was interesting that grizzly bears did not do that. They had never seen grizzlies do that, but black bears did. So as he said, he told his archaeologist friend, and they had a good laugh about it. But it is a very instructive story, because it really shows how Charlie worked. And it also is a kind of a nice contrast in terms of how the sort of the, I don't know what, you know, I struggle linguistics. I have a degree in linguistics, so I'm kind of fascinated with language stuff. But anyways, the Western colonial, the way we're taught in most universities and situations, it's a very different approach to understanding phenomena and seeing the world. And so from that perspective, it's kind of um, a nice little contrast as well.
I would also like to ask about sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, the bear that ate someone because he was not because he was having a bad life and not brought not brought in at the right time. It was the person's scientific fault that they set him up for failure. Could you talk about how scientists need to better understand bears in order to better serve them?
There was actually two stories. Well, I'll tell one, if I may. I'll keep it short. And I did want to bring this up. There's one, when Charlie was in Russia, he had met a very famous a photographer, Misha Hoshino. And he had, you know, he was very excited because he really admired his beautiful photography, and they got to meet, and then they were all excited. And they were at this camp where there was another group of environmentalists, and then the film crew, and the film crew was making a documentary about Misha Hoshino. So Charlie was there and, you know, flew over from his lake, which was about 20 miles. And they spent the evening together, and he was very disturbed because this bear, brown bear, grizzly bear, had come into camp, and he'd been hearing stories that the bear had broken into helicopters, broken into this and that. And it was a very un-bear-like thing to do. So Charlie was nervous, and he was made more nervous because the Russian person there suggested that they all stay in the hut, the wooden hut, rather than camping. And Misha wanted to, he joked that the producer snored, so let's sleep out in our tent. And Charlie was nervous about that because he would use electric fences around his tent when he felt there was some bear, what he would call unhappy bear. And he made the joke. He said, well, he kind of, and they talked all night, you know, they just really hit it off. And he kind of joked. He said, well, I really wasn't worried about myself, but I was worried about my, he had a small ultralight plane, you know, that the bear would go in there. Anyways, he left for the day, and I came back. And when he came back, he found out that the bear had killed Misha Hoshino and had broken into the tent and pulled him away to be. And of course, the bear was killed. And when he found out, this is Charlie again, digging. What was this? This is like weird. At the camp, people were very rude to the bear. The environmentalist group were throwing things at the bear while he was in the stream, etc., making fun of him. So it turned out that this bear was orphaned. His mother had been killed, and then he was taken into town to be a pet or whatever. And a biologist was called, who was a colleague of Charlie's. Can you get rid of this bear? So Igor brought the bear. It was a big, long thing. Took him to an island in the lake. Got lots of salmon and nuts, and closed up the bear because it was November, you know, for hibernation. They hibernate for 6 or 7 months there. And so, you know, he went back and checked. Everything seemed fine. In May, the bear had broken out, and it seemed like, great, you know, everything's going to be fine. Well, there were subsequent issues, you know, that happened. And of course, the culmination was Michio's death. And of course, from my perspective, and we go into this, is that the trauma, the severe trauma that these bears and other wildlife are sustaining, they are vulnerable. Their whole lives are disrupted. Their sense of meaning is disrupted. And I think there's very strong parallels with Native peoples. that they are not able to live the lives that they have evolved and learned to be and have those values. Just simply, they are, their home is, they're refugees in their home. That's the way I put it. So that was one story. And Charlie started carrying bear spray, as he said, when he remembered it, even when he was in Waterton up in the mountains, because, and I'll use my language, because of the trauma. Most of the bears have been shot at. When they're killed, you often find bullets in them, like they've had many things. They've had their mothers killed, they've seen killed, they're constantly approached fearfully. And so there's other incidents that you'll hear about, like researchers. There was a famous one in Yellowstone where a man who's in his 70s, he'd been there like 50 years, going there every year, a botanist, was attacked and killed by a grizzly bear. Well, that grizzly bear had been darted and anesthetized by researchers to find out something. And then they left, and he woke up, and I don't know if any of you have had surgery or any kind of trauma. It's very disorienting. He didn't want to happen. He killed the man, which was very out of the ordinary. So there's another story in there as well, where these biologists are tying up, they have a snag and they get this bear, and I don't know what they're going to do with him, but he gets into a snag, and it's horrible for Charlie. He hears the bellowing and the screaming. And so the researchers are not intending to kill him, but they have a dart gun, this big kind of elephant type gun, and they shoot him, they dart him, and again, he goes through this kind of thing. So that's example, and that was something that Charlie found very disturbing, is in our quote unquote effort to, it's very possessive, it's very grasping to know, in ways that are destructive. So you destroy what quote unquote one loves. And of all people, Charlie, I'm sure there may be others in terms of Native peoples in particular, but Charlie knows bears, understands bears better than anyone, without any kind of violence whatsoever. And I kind of rolled in 3 stories in once.
No, that was all excellent. My name is Paul Richmond here, just stepping in as one of the panelists. So many stories today from the various authors, people might say, oh, really? Did that really happen? And, in terms of other folks, what's your comments or thoughts about trying to explain to people who have not had the experience, or why they don't even open up to realizing animal whisperers or people who communicate, or Charlie's ability to be present and feel as though he is hearing, there is a communications, and he's adapting and communicating back and forth. Is it just our being so separated out from animals that it's our dog that you feed? You don't really think that you or that you can't do that with other wild animals. I'm just curious in terms of your own thoughts on all that. Thank you.
Well, for one thing, and I've encountered it since I started working with Charlie, and I encounter people who are fearful, terrified of bears. And none of them that I have encountered, none of them have ever seen a bear. It's a myth that is promulgated by scientists, researchers, and policy, and the agencies. Where it got started. And I have a chapter, I think it's one of the introductions, where I go into that. There is no foundation scientifically for that. Now, why does that happen? Well, it's a culture. It's a killing culture. There's a lot of practical things, the image, there's a business associated when you have hunting and fishing tags. That's money and revenues that supports the wildlife agencies. Researchers are taught to objectify, that's there, and it's getting a little bit different now, where there's empathy and compassionate conservation. But that really boils down, nonetheless, conservation, even if it's compassionate conservation, is a colonial agenda. It's self-determination. It's conservation is us controlling someone else. And so we're really talking about self-determination. So there are practical, economic, and psychological types of things. I think that many people, being outdoors is very unfamiliar, and it's very scary. And it's reified by that. And there's an element of the risk. You know, I asked Charlie about, I gave him a good Duncan experiment. I said, okay, Charlie, now you're the head of Waterton. What would you do? And ooh, you know, because, you know, the tourists are told to get big, make lots of noise, you know, and those are things from what Charlie says is, you know, bears are like, whoa, what are they upset about? It puts everyone on edge. And now that you have all this trauma, and it's not just bears, it's deer. And if you look, you can see that. They've also wiped out the elders. So you do not have this, like the elephant book I talk about, you don't have this deep bench of cultural learning and understanding. And their heritage does not prepare them to live in the kinds of landscapes that they are having to live in. There's roads, there's guns, there's noise, etc. So why do people feel that way? Because nature, we are separate from nature. We see separate from nature, even though we're part of it. And people don't know what to do. They really don't know what to do. And they don't see so there's many different things, but I think a primary one is this myth machine. And these are from scientists who now recognize animal emotions and sentience. But something that I have found kind of startling, you know, people write all these, they're hardcore scientists and they write these nice books about animals, you know, that they're sentient and they have emotions and nice stories and everything, but they draw the line. We are not willing, okay, there's the we word, humanity at large, whatever you want to call it, is not willing, the majority of people are not willing to give up their privilege. So for example, we had a black bear around here a few years ago, and they're around, and he was big and he was grumpy and he was old. And I walked out on the deck, which looks over our little creek, and he was lying on his stomach, and I went, hi. And he went, rah. And I'm like, oh, you know, my feelings were hurt, right? And, you know, I remember telling Charlie about it, you know, and he says, he's old and he's grumpy and he doesn't give a shit about you. I mean, no, he just lying down there, you know? And so he was around a lot and he was grumpy. You know, basically around here, someone sees a bear, it's like, oh my God, there's a bear. And they call the wildlife and he gets shot. So we put food out for him so he would stay here, because typically they stay around for a few days and then they go to the high country where the berries are. We changed our lifestyle. I mean, I to avoid kind of any kind of friction. So we kept our dogs in, you know, we have cats on their harnesses and we kept them, and we changed our life to accommodate where he was at. And everything was fine until he wandered off the property, and the woman down the way, who had no idea, called Fish and Wildlife and they shot him. So, you know, it's a kind of a risk type of thing, you know, people want everything to be controlled. So I think at the core is we just have to let go of control. And I mean, don't do stupid things. Like, for example, with Charlie, you know, I'm teaching a course on mindfulness and nature consciousness. And the point being is Charlie had this encounter with this bear. It's quite phenomenal. I'm probably talking too long. Can I talk one more minute? I'll tell you one quick story. No one said anything, but I will. So he was in Russia, really happy. It was like the first year he was there. Oh my God. And he sees this beautiful big brown bear. It's not Brandy. Beautiful, beautiful. Oh my God, she's so gorgeous, right? He's excited because she didn't run away. And then he went, uh-oh, she has 2 little cubs. And the 2 little cubs are closer to him than to her. Well, she looks at him, and they do have illegal poaching in there that has had an impact. And she starts running straight at him. Okay. So Charlie just keeps talking. He turns his body at a slight angle, so like that, right? He leans down and picks up some of the yellow goldenrod that's in the thing. And she stops. And she
basically gets her kids and leaves. Now, as that's something that I wouldn't recommend for everyone. And Charlie certainly had this flash of fear, but he talked about fear informed, but not fear determined. And so Charlie, in a sense, you could say, trained in mindfulness his whole life. And he's not stupid. I mean, there's a reason that he does it. And he's not into this bravado. He never carried guns. Bears know about that too. They know you're not carrying a gun. And they picked up on that. So I'm not trying to say that's what everyone does, because we're also dealing in a transition. We're talking about, in this last conversation, all of these different ideas and people and experiences are coming together, and there's a lot of uncertainty and hostility and vulnerability. And the animals are like that too. So our job, I think, is we need to build buffer. We need to pull back so that they are able to feel relaxed, which means no hunting, no genocide, and if deer in your garden, fine, that kind of thing, which really brings us back into fitting in to nature, as Charlie would call it.
Thank you, Dr. Bradshaw. That was full of great stories, just like the book.
Well, thank you for all your questions and your patience.